The stage lights were already on, 8,000 people packed into the Jacksonville Municipal Auditorium, and the promoter's hand was shaking as he blocked Elvis Presley's path to the stage. "You need to understand something, son," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "We've got a rope down the middle of that auditorium. Whites on the left, coloreds on the right. That's how we do things here in Florida. That's how we've always done things. And if you've got a problem with that, you can walk out that door right now, and we'll keep every penny of your fee." What Elvis did in the next 12 minutes didn't just shock the Jim Crow South. It started a quiet revolution that would echo through the civil rights movement and prove that sometimes the most powerful protest comes not from a speech or a march, but from a 21-year-old kid from Memphis who simply refused to play along with hatred. Before we dive into this true story of courage that changed American history, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that music belongs to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to witness is the moment when rock and roll became more than just music. It became a weapon against injustice. Jacksonville, Florida, August 10th, 1956. The humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, and the tension backstage at the Municipal Auditorium was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elvis Presley stood in a cramped dressing room that smelled of old cigarettes and cheaper cologne, staring at himself in a mirror ringed with naked light bulbs. He was 21 years old, and his life had changed so fast in the past 6 months that he sometimes felt like he was watching it happen to someone else. 6 months ago, he'd been a truck driver in Memphis, making $40 a week and dreaming of maybe, someday, recording a song that people might actually hear on the radio. Now he was the biggest sensation in American music. His single, Heartbreak Hotel, had hit #1 on the charts. Ed Sullivan had paid him $50,000 to appear on television. Teenage girls screamed his name and fainted at his concerts. He got from nobody to somebody so fast it made his head spin. But success had brought complications that his mama, Gladys, had warned him about. "Baby," she said just before he left Memphis for this Florida tour, "when you get famous, everybody wants a piece of you. And some of those people, they're going to want you to compromise who you are. Don't you do it, Elvis Aaron. Don't you ever forget where you came from or what's right and what's wrong." Elvis could hear his mama's voice in his head now as he looked at his reflection. He'd grown up in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a shotgun house so poor that sometimes there wasn't enough food for dinner. His neighborhood had been mixed, black families and white families living side by side in the kind of poverty that doesn't discriminate by color. His best friend growing up had been a black kid named Samuel Bell, who taught Elvis his first guitar chords on the porch of a church where Samuel's father was a preacher. The music Elvis loved, the music that had shaped his soul and given him a reason to dream beyond the poverty of his childhood, had come from black artists. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Arthur Crudup, Big Mama Thornton. He'd spent his teenage years sneaking into clubs on Beale Street in Memphis, the only white face in rooms full of black musicians who played with a fire and a passion that made Elvis's heart race. Those musicians had welcomed him, taught him, shaped him into the performer he'd become. And now some white promoter in Florida wanted him to stand on a stage and pretend that half his audience wasn't good enough to sit on the same side of a rope as the other half. The dressing room door opened and Bill Black, Elvis's bass player, stuck his head in. "Elvis, man, we got a problem out here." Elvis turned from the mirror. "I heard that promoter telling me about the rope." "It ain't just a rope, Elvis." Bill stepped fully into the room, followed by Scotty Moore, Elvis's guitarist, and DJ Fontana, his drummer. All three men looked uncomfortable, their faces tight with tension. The whole auditorium is split down the middle. They got separate entrances, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. White folks paid $3 for their tickets. Black folks paid $2, but they're crammed into half the space. And that promoter, he's making it real clear that if you don't like it, you don't perform. Elvis felt something hot and sharp twist in his chest. It was anger, but it was more than anger. It was a feeling he carried with him since childhood, a deep and visceral understanding of what it felt like to be treated as less than human because of circumstances beyond your control. He'd been the poor kid, the white trash from the wrong side of town. He knew what it felt like when people looked through you like you didn't exist. But this was different. This was systematic. This was an entire system built on the idea that the color of your skin determined your worth as a human being. And they wanted him to participate in it. They wanted him to take the stage and pretend it was normal, pretend it was right, Pretend that the music in his heart hadn't come from the very people they were forcing to sit on the other side of that rope. "Where's Colonel Parker?" Elvis asked quietly. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, had been the one who'd booked this tour. He was a shrewd businessman who cared about one thing above all else: making money. And segregated shows in the South made a lot of money because they allowed promoters to sell more tickets by packing people in on both sides of the racial divide. "He's out there talking to the promoter now," Scotty said. "Elvis, listen, I know this feels wrong. It feels wrong to all of us. But we got a contract. And if we break that contract, they're going to sue us for everything we're worth. Parker says we can't afford to walk away." Elvis looked at his three bandmates, men he trusted, men who'd been with him since the beginning. "Y'all think we should just play the show? Just go out there and pretend we don't see that rope?" There was a long silence. Finally, DJ spoke up. "Elvis, I got a wife and a baby at home. I need this job. I ain't saying it's right, but I'm saying I got responsibilities." "I got responsibilities too," Elvis said softly. "I got a responsibility to the people who made me who I am. And a lot of those people are sitting on the wrong side of that rope right now." The door opened again, and Colonel Parker walked in. He was a big man, nearly 300 pounds, with a cigar permanently clamped between his teeth, an expression that suggested he'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "Elvis, my boy," he said in that smooth voice that always made Elvis feel like he was being sold something. "We need to have a conversation about reality." "I'm listening," Elvis said. "The reality is this." Parker closed the door behind him and leaned against it, blocking the exit. "You signed a contract to perform here tonight. That contract is legally binding. If you refuse to perform, we are in breach of that contract and the promoters can sue us for damages. Do you know how much money we're talking about? Enough to bankrupt you, son. Enough to end your career before it really begins." "I don't care about the money," Elvis said. Parker's expression darkened. "Well, you should care. Because it ain't just your money. It's mine, too. And your band's. And everyone else who depends on you for their livelihood. You want to be a hero? Fine. But you're going to be a broke hero, and you're going to take a lot of good people down with you." Elvis felt the weight of those words pressing down on him. He thought about his mama and his daddy, still living in the little house in Memphis that he'd bought them with his first big paycheck. He thought about Bill and Scotty and DJ and their families. He thought about all the people who worked for him, who depended on him. But then he thought about something else. He thought about a night 2 years ago when he'd been playing a small club in Memphis, one of those integrated clubs where black and white people could mix without anyone calling the police. There'd been a young black couple in the front row, holding hands, their eyes shining as they watched Elvis perform. During the break, the young man had approached Elvis, his voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. Presley," he'd said, "I just want to thank you. My daddy, he plays blues guitar, and he never thought he'd see the day when a white boy could play our music and make white people listen to it. But you're doing it. You're building a bridge, man. You're showing people that music doesn't have a color. And that gives me hope that maybe someday the world might change." Elvis had never forgotten that conversation. He'd never forgotten the hope in that young man's eyes, the belief that music could be more than entertainment, that it could be a force for change, for unity, for breaking down the walls that hate had built. And now he was being asked to stand on a stage divided by a rope that represented everything he'd been fighting against, even if he'd been fighting quietly, even if he'd been fighting just by being himself and loving the music he loved. "Colonel," Elvis said slowly, "I respect what you're saying. I know there's money at stake. But there's something more important than money at stake here. There's principle. There's right and wrong. And this," he gestured toward the auditorium beyond the dressing room, "this is wrong. And I won't be a part of it." Parker's face turned red. "You're making a mistake, boy. You're letting your emotions override your business sense. This is how things are done in the South. You can't change it. All you can do is accept it and move on." "Maybe I can't change it," Elvis said, "but I don't have to accept it. I don't have to participate in it. And I won't." "Then you're fired," Parker said coldly. "I'm done managing you. You're on your own." The room went silent. Elvis felt his heart pounding in his chest. Colonel Parker had connections, influence, power. Without Parker, his career might be over before it really began. But even as that thought crossed his mind, Elvis felt a strange sense of clarity, a peace that came from knowing he was doing the right thing, even if it cost him everything. Okay, Elvis said simply. Then I'm on my own. Parker stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether Elvis was bluffing. Then he shook his head in disgust, turned, and walked out of the dressing room, slamming the door behind him. Bill, Scotty, and DJ looked at Elvis with a mixture of admiration and fear. Elvis, Bill said quietly, what are we going to do? Elvis took a deep breath. We're going to go talk to that promoter. And we're going to tell him that if he wants Elvis Presley to perform tonight, that rope comes down. All the way down. No segregation. No separation. One audience. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. And if he leaves it, Scotty asked. Then we pack up our instruments and we go home, Elvis said. And we find another way to make music. The four men walked out of the dressing room and down the narrow corridor that led to the backstage area. Elvis could hear the crowd beyond the curtain, 8,000 people talking, laughing, waiting for the show to begin. He could feel the energy, the anticipation, the electric excitement that always preceded one of his performances. The promoter, a thick-necked man named Frank Billings who wore a white suit that was too tight across his belly, was waiting for them near the stage entrance. His face was already red with anger, and when he saw Elvis approaching, he held up one meaty hand. I just talked to your manager, Billings said. And he told me you're having some kind of moral crisis about our seating arrangements. It's not a crisis, Elvis said calmly. It's a decision. I won't perform for a segregated audience. If you want me on that stage, you take down the rope. You let people sit wherever they want. Black, white, it doesn't matter. One audience. Billings's face turned an even deeper shade of red. Do you have any idea what you're asking? This is Florida, boy. We got laws here. We got traditions. You can't just come in here from Tennessee and tell us how to run things. I'm not telling you how to run things, Elvis said. I'm telling you how I run things. And I don't perform for segregated audiences. That's my rule. Not negotiable. You sign a contract, Billings sputtered. You got a legal obligation. Then sue me, Elvis said simply. But I'm not going on that stage until that rope comes down. For a moment, Billings just stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then he seemed to make a decision. Fine, he spat. Fine. You want to throw away your career for a bunch of... He caught himself before finishing the sentence, glancing at the growing crowd of backstage personnel who were watching the confrontation. You do what you gotta do. But you ain't performing here tonight. And you ain't getting paid. And I'm going to make sure every promoter in the South knows that Elvis Presley is trouble. You'll never work below the Mason-Dixon line again. Elvis felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Bill standing beside him. If Elvis ain't performing, Bill said quietly, then we ain't performing either. Scotty stepped forward. That's right. We're a band. We stick together. DJ nodded. All for one. Elvis felt a surge of gratitude for his friends, these men who were willing to risk their own livelihoods to stand with him. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from the crowd of backstage workers. I'll take down the rope. Everyone turned. A young black man in a janitor's uniform stepped forward. He was maybe 19 years old, tall and thin, with kind eyes and nervous hands that twisted the brim of the cap he was holding. I work here, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I clean this place. And I heard what Mr. Presley said about not performing for a segregated audience. And I just want to say, he paused, swallowing hard. I just want to say thank you. My name is Marcus Washington, and I've been cleaning this auditorium for 2 years, and every single show we have, I got to watch white folks walk through the front door while my people walk around back. And I got to mop the white bathrooms that are clean while the colored bathrooms are falling apart. And I'm sick of it. I'm tired of it. And if Mr. Presley wants that rope taken down, I'll do it myself. Billings's face went purple. You're fired, Washington. Get out of here right now. But Marcus didn't move. And then another voice spoke up. An older white man, one of the stagehands, stepped forward. I'll help him take down the rope. Me too, said a woman who worked the concession stand. "Count me in," said one of the lighting technicians. Within seconds, a dozen people had stepped forward, black and white, all of them workers at the auditorium, all of them volunteering to take down the segregation barrier. Billings looked around in shock, realizing he was losing control of the situation. "You're all fired," he shouted. "Every single one of you." "Then fire us," Marcus said, and there was something new in his voice now, something stronger. "But that rope is coming down. Mr. Presley is right. It's 1956. It's time for things to change." Elvis felt tears stinging his eyes. He'd come here tonight prepared to walk away from his career if necessary. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected an entire group of people to risk their jobs to support him, to support the principle of equality and human dignity. He walked over to Marcus and held out his hand. "Thank you," he said softly. "Thank you for your courage." Marcus shook his hand, his eyes shining. "No, sir. Thank you for using your voice, for standing up." What happened next will be talked about in Jacksonville for the next 50 years. Marcus Washington, followed by the group of workers who'd volunteered to help him, walked out onto the stage while 8,000 people watched in confusion. They went to the rope that divided the auditorium down the middle, that physical manifestation of segregation and hatred, and they started taking it down. At first, the white side of the audience began to boo. Angry shouts filled the air. "What are you doing? Put that back up. This ain't right." But then something remarkable happened. From the black side of the audience, people started to stand up. Slowly at first, then faster, until hundreds of black audience members were on their feet, applauding, cheering, some of them crying openly as they watched that rope come down. And then, even more remarkably, some of the white audience members started standing too. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough. Young people, mostly teenagers who'd come to see Elvis and who didn't understand why music should be divided by color. They stood and they applauded, and gradually the boos were drowned out by cheers. Frank Billings stood backstage, watching his carefully segregated audience transform into something else, something unified. His face had gone from red to white, and his hands were shaking. He knew he'd lost. He knew the night had spiraled beyond his control. He turned to Elvis. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Fine. The rope is down. Now get on that stage and perform before I lose every penny I invested in this show." Elvis looked at him steadily. "I'll perform," he said. "But first, I got something to say to that audience." He walked out onto the stage before Billings could protest. The crowd, now mixed and no longer divided by a rope, erupted in screams. Elvis picked up the microphone, and for a moment he just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces, black and white, all of them looking back at him with excitement and anticipation. Elvis pulled out his wallet and took out all the cash he had, about $500. He pressed it into Marcus's hand. "For your education," he said. "And Marcus, don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't make a difference. Don't ever let anyone convince you that things can't change. You've got power. Use it." Marcus stared at the money, tears streaming down his face again. "I can't take this." "You can and you will," Elvis said firmly. "Consider it an investment." "I'm investing in you, Marcus. I'm investing in the future. And someday, when you're doing great things, I want you to remember this night. Remember that change starts with one person willing to say no to injustice." The story of what happened in Jacksonville that night spread quickly. Colonel Parker, despite his anger, was savvy enough to recognize a publicity opportunity when he saw one. Within a week, newspapers across the country were running stories about Elvis Presley, the young rock and roll star who'd refused to perform for a segregated audience. Some of the coverage was positive. Northern newspapers praised Elvis for his stand against segregation. Civil rights leaders began to take notice of this young white singer who seemed to genuinely respect and honor the black community that had given birth to the music he loved. But some of the coverage was vicious. Southern newspapers attacked him as a race traitor. Radio stations in some states banned his music. Promoters canceled shows. Elvis received death threats from white supremacist groups who saw him as a danger to their way of life. Colonel Parker, who'd initially been furious with Elvis, eventually came around. He realized that controversy sold records, and Elvis's stand in Jacksonville, far from ending his career, had actually elevated his profile. "You're a smart kid," Parker told Elvis a few weeks later. "Smarter than I gave you credit for." You knew that taking a stand would make you bigger. That was good business. It wasn't about business, Colonel, Elvis said quietly. It was about doing what was right. But Parker just laughed. He'd never understand. He'd never see that for Elvis, that night in Jacksonville hadn't been a calculated career move. It had been a moment of truth, a moment when he'd been forced to choose between comfort and conviction, between money and morality, between the easy path and the right path. And he'd chosen right. Years later, after Elvis had become the biggest star in the world, after he'd conquered Hollywood and Las Vegas and become a global icon, he would look back on the Jacksonville show as one of the most important nights of his life. Not because of the music he'd performed, not because of the size of the crowd or the amount of money he'd made, but because it was the night he discovered that his voice, his platform, his fame could be used for something more than just entertainment. It could be used for justice. Marcus Washington went on to become a civil rights attorney, one of the most respected legal minds in the South. He spent his career fighting segregation, defending activists, and working to dismantle the legal structures of Jim Crow. And in every office he ever worked in, on every desk, there was a photograph from that night in Jacksonville, a young Elvis Presley on stage, and in the audience, no rope dividing the crowd, just people united by music. Whenever anyone asked Marcus about that photograph, he would tell them the story. About a 21-year-old kid who could have taken the easy path, who could have performed for that segregated audience and collected his paycheck and moved on. But instead, he'd stood up. He'd said no. He'd risked everything because he believed that music belonged to everyone, that humanity was more important than contracts, that doing right was more valuable than making money. Elvis Presley saved my life that night, Marcus would say. Not literally, but spiritually. He showed me that one person can make a difference. He showed me that standing up to injustice is always worth it, even when it costs you something. And he showed me that sometimes the most powerful form of protest isn't violence or anger. It's simply refusing to participate in a system that's wrong. When Elvis died in 1977, Marcus Washington was one of the mourners at Graceland. He stood in line for hours, waiting for his chance to pay respects to the man who'd changed his life. When he finally reached the casket, he placed a hand on the polished wood and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Presley. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for showing me what it means to stand up. Thank you for proving that music, that art, that human connection is stronger than hate." The story of the Jacksonville show became part of Elvis's legacy, a reminder that the king of rock and roll was more than just an entertainer. He was a bridge between cultures, a voice for unity, a young man who'd understood, perhaps better than most people of his generation, that music had the power to break down barriers and bring people together. And it all started with a simple decision. A decision to refuse to perform for a segregated audience. A decision that took 12 minutes to unfold and change the South forever. Because that's how revolutions start. Not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with one person standing up and saying, "This is wrong, and I won't be part of it." Elvis Presley said those words on a humid night in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1956. And the world, slowly but surely, began to listen. If this story of courage and conviction moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that one person can make a difference. That standing up for what's right always matters, even when it costs you something. That music, art, and human connection are more powerful than the forces of division and hate. Elvis showed us that you don't have to be a politician or an activist to change the world. You just have to be willing to stand up when it matters, to say no to injustice, to believe that your voice, your choices, your actions can ripple outward and touch lives in ways you might never fully understand. The rope came down that night in Jacksonville. And though the fight for civil rights would continue for many more years, though the road to equality would be long and painful and costly, that night proved something important. Change is possible. Unity is possible. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to risk everything to do what's right. That was Elvis, the kid from Tupelo, the truck driver from Memphis, the king of rock and roll. And that night, he became something even greater. He became a man who chose principle over profit, conviction over comfort, and justice over everything else. That's the Elvis we should remember. Not just the entertainer, but the revolutionary, the bridge builder, the young man who understood that true greatness isn't measured by fame or fortune, but by the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world is watching and waiting to see if you'll back down. Elvis didn't back down, and the world has never been the same.